Next, we'll discuss the wealth of our nation, Indian removal and the technology of torture. We now move from south to north. Anglo-American racism was like an invasive tree. The seed of white superiority was planted in the soil of anti-Indigenous ideas. As a rapidly growing sapling, it invented a new people, white people, then liberated itself from the British Empire. It dug further into virgin soil through Indian removal, watered by the copious blood of slaves, and hardened into one of the world's largest economies. Its trunk solidified through establishing Jim Crow, invading Mexico, exploiting Chinese and Japanese labor, colonizing Pacific and Caribbean islands, all while instituting affirmative action for whites. Invasion, removal, and enslavement. Anglo-American racist policies for the 19th century were the inspiration for Hitler's plan of a Nazi Europe. Hitler himself asked, "Who remembers the Red Indians?" Let's examine Hitler's inspiration. In the early 1800s, 5 southeastern tribes were considered a problem by Anglo-Americans like President Andrew Jackson, who signed the 1830 Indian Removal Act. One by one, the Creek, Choctaw, Seminoles, Chickasaws, and Cherokee were coerced, tricked, fought in court, and forced by bayonet from millions of acres of their ancestral land in the southeast. We cannot imagine how this felt, but we must take a moment to remember the courage of the Creek defending themselves against General Andrew Jackson in 1814, the strength of the Seminoles throughout their 3 separate wars between 1817 to 1858. We can respect the sober decision of the Choctaws, who first signed a removal treaty forced by President Jackson, and the hopefulness of the Creek in signing a non-removal treaty before also being pushed out by the US military as white squatters colonized their homes. And finally, we must lament the tragedy of the Cherokee. After attempting to assimilate through a written constitution to European patterns of life, they were betrayed by a small number of their own who negotiated a treaty behind the backs of their chief and leaders. Over 16,000 Cherokee refused to capitulate until forced by bayonet out of their home, put into stockades, and marched with only the clothes on their backs over thousands of miles in deadly conditions, while white looters stole what little they had. Fully 1/4 of them perished from the journey. Their trail of tears forced the removal of what some estimate was up to 100,000 Southeastern Native peoples and led up to 15,000 deaths among the Aboriginal Americans. Once the Native American lands were cleared, Anglo-Americans needed to labor to cultivate it. This labor came from the Upper South, where Black families were separated and sold down south. 1 million people were marched and chained to the newly stolen Native American lands in the Deep South, along with Edward Ball calls the Slave Trail of Tears. This migration was 20 times larger than Indian removal and bigger than the wagon train migrations to here in the West. According to economic historians, one crop was more important than any other in igniting the Industrial Revolution, which we all still benefit from today. US produced cotton was, quote, an essential component of worldwide economic growth, unquote, according to Edward Baptist. But cotton is difficult to grow and harvest. Somehow, the production of cotton jumped, dropping the cost of cotton precipitously. Was it the cotton gin? No, it was the labor. Each individual enslaved person somehow managed to increase their individual efficiency 400% by the time of the Civil War. But people aren't machines. How did they become 400% more efficient? The answer, a system of torture and measurement. Every enslaved person had carefully calibrated individual goals for how much cotton to pick. These goals were recorded in cotton picking ledgers, like the one on the left from an 1852 Mississippi slave labor camp, with daily weights of cotton production. Men, women, and children who did not meet their targets were whipped immediately until they sometimes vomited and fainted, and then still longer. Enslavers would sometimes whip them even if they had produced their goals. But once they consistently did, it was simply increased again until one slave in 1860 was expected to pick as much as 4 slaves had in 1800. This technology of torture drove the Industrial Revolution. In 1800, the United Kingdom, shown in blue, had the largest economy in the Western world, while the US, here in orange, was an agrarian society consisting of mostly farmers. China and India, by virtue of their population size, had the world's largest economies. By 1870, the US had surpassed the UK in gross domestic product, and it very soon had the largest economy in the world. In other words, the US became the largest economy in the world from torturing Black Americans on indigenous lands.